Hello there, and welcome. Tonight we are going to travel together through one of the most quietly astonishing landscapes that has ever existed. Not a jungle, not an ocean, not the surface of some distant and half-lit moon, but the human mind itself. The inner world, the place where every thought you have ever had first appeared, shimmering and uncertain, before it became something you could call your own. The place where every fear has lived, and every hope, and every small private joy that you have never quite found the words to share with anyone else. Psychology, the study of the mind and human behavior, is at its heart a love story. It is humanity's long, patient attempt to understand itself, and that is a project that has been underway, in one form or another, for as long as human beings have been capable of sitting quietly and wondering why they feel the way they feel. Which is to say, it has been underway for a very, very long time. Tonight, we will move through that history slowly and gently, the way a river moves through a wide and unhurried valley. We will visit the ancient Greeks, who first gave the mind a name and wondered whether the soul was made of fire. We will walk through the dimly lit consulting rooms of 19th century Vienna, where a bearded doctor named Sigmund Freud sat in a leather chair and really listened to his patients in a way that few people ever had before. We will explore the strange and beautiful discoveries of sleep researchers, memory scientists, and the quiet pioneers of positive psychology, who turn their attention not towards what breaks the mind, but towards what allows it to flourish. And through all of it, we will move at the pace of a long, deep breath. There is nothing here that needs to be memorized. There is nothing here that requires your full attention. You're welcome to let the words wash over you like water, catching only what catches you, releasing the rest. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. For now, let your shoulders soften just a little. Let your breathing slow to its own natural pace. Let the day, with all its weights and its worries, begin to fall away from you like a coat you no longer need to wear. Let's begin. The ancient Greeks believed that the mind lived in the heart. This is worth pausing over for a moment, because it tells us something important, not just about what the Greeks believed, but about how hard it has always been to locate the self. They looked inward and felt the pulse of something vital and warm and undeniable, and they concluded that this, here, in the chest, was the seat of thought and feeling and memory and will. Aristotle himself held this view. He believed the brain was a kind of cooling organ, something the body used to regulate the heat generated by the passionate thinking heart. He was, of course, mistaken about this particular detail, but the mistake is a tender one. It came from paying attention, it came from trying. The word psychology itself comes from the Greek word psyche, which is usually translated as soul or mind, and the Greek word logos, which means study or reason. So psychology is quite literally the reasoned study of the soul, and that framing soul rather than brain, study rather than experiment, tells us a great deal about how differently the ancient world approached the questions we now consider scientific. For the Greeks, the mind was not a biological object to be dissected. It was a philosophical problem to be contemplated. It was something that pointed always toward larger questions about what it meant to be human, what it meant to live well, and what the relationship was between the individual person and the vast, indifferent, beautiful cosmos in which they found themselves. Plato, who was Aristotle's teacher and one of the most influential thinkers who has ever lived, believed that the psyche was immortal. He thought that the soul existed before birth and would continue to exist after death, carrying with it the memory of a perfect invisible realm of pure ideas, what he called the forms. In his view, learning was not the acquisition of new knowledge, but the gradual remembering of things the soul already knew. He called this process anamnesis, which means unforgetting, and there is something quietly beautiful about that idea. Even if we no longer believe it in a literal sense, the notion that understanding is not the building of something new, but the clearing away of everything that obscures what was always already there. Aristotle took a somewhat different view. He was more interested in the observable world, in what the senses could tell us, in the way that living creatures actually behaved. He wrote extensively about memory and perception and dreams and emotion. He noticed that people dream, and he wondered why a question that would not receive anything approaching a satisfying answer for more than 2,000 years. He observed that strong emotions can cloud judgment, and he wrote about what he called catharsis, the purging or purification of difficult feelings through art and storytelling. His basic insight that giving form to emotion can help to release it is one that modern therapists still find useful, 23 centuries after he first put it into words. There is something comforting about that continuity. The questions haven't changed as much as we might expect. We are still, in many ways, the same puzzled creatures who sat around fires in ancient Greece and wondered what it is that makes us who we are. Hippocrates, who lived around the same time and is often called the father of medicine, was one of the first to suggest that mental disturbances had physical causes. This was a radical departure from the prevailing view, which held that conditions like epilepsy or what we might now call depression were the work of gods or spirits. Hippocrates disagreed. He believed that the brain was the organ of thought and feeling, and that when the brain was disturbed by illness, by injury, by an imbalance of the substances he called humours, the mind would suffer as a consequence. He described what he called melancholia, a condition of profound sadness and hopelessness, and proposed that it arose from an excess of black bile in the body. His theory of the humours was not correct in its details, but his basic instinct that the mind and the body are not separate, that what affects one affects the other, was remarkably far-sighted. We are still, in the 21st century, working out exactly how that relationship operates. The four humours that Hippocrates and later Galen described, blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, shaped the understanding of human personality and mental health for nearly 1,500 years. A person with too much blood was thought to be sanguine, cheerful, optimistic, sociable, a little impulsive. A person with too much phlegm was phlegmatic, calm, slow to react, reliable, perhaps a little detached. Too much yellow bile made a person choleric, energetic, passionate, easily angered. Too much black bile produced the melancholic temperament, thoughtful, anxious, prone to sadness and creative intensity. These categories are not scientifically accurate, of course, but it is worth noting that they have not entirely disappeared. The words themselves, sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, melancholic, are still used in everyday English to describe human personalities and emotional states. And some modern personality researchers have found that the broad strokes of the humoral temperament system map, in rough and imperfect ways, onto some of the personality dimensions that contemporary psychology identifies. This doesn't mean the ancients were right. It means they were paying attention. It means they were noticing real patterns in human behaviour and trying, with the tools they had, to make sense of them. From here, the story shifts to the long, quiet centuries of the medieval world. During the Middle Ages in Europe, roughly the 500 years between the fall of Rome and the beginning of the Renaissance, The study of the mind became deeply intertwined with Christian theology. The soul was still the central concern, but now it was understood through the framework of sin and salvation, of temptation and grace, of the ongoing struggle between the divine and the fallen. Mental disturbances were often interpreted as spiritual crises or as evidence of demonic influence. This was a difficult time for those who suffered from what we would now recognize as mental illness. But it was not entirely a time of darkness and fear. Within the monasteries and convents of medieval Europe, there existed a tradition of careful attention to the inner life that was, in its own way, quite sophisticated. Monastic communities developed detailed practices for the cultivation of mental discipline and emotional regulation. They wrote extensively about what they called the passions, the strong emotions and desires that could disrupt a person's peace and lead them away from virtue. They distinguished between emotions that were fleeting and those that had taken root deeply in the character. They recognized that thoughts could arise unbidden, that the mind could wander against the will of the thinker, and they developed contemplative practices designed to address exactly this phenomenon. The word acedia, which medieval monks used to describe a particular kind of listlessness and spiritual torpor, a difficulty engaging with prayer, with work, with the community is remarkably similar to what we might now describe as depression or burnout. The monk Evagrius Ponticus, writing in the 4th century, described acedia as the most troublesome of all the demons he'd encountered in his desert contemplations. He noted that it typically struck in the middle of the day, when the sun was at its highest and the heat was most oppressive, and that it produced a listlessness so profound that the afflicted monk might find himself staring out the window, unable to do anything, plagued by restlessness and an inability to settle. Reading that description from the distance of 17 centuries, it is hard not to feel a kind of quiet recognition. If your eyes are growing heavy now, that is perfectly fine. Let them close. The story will carry on around you, unhurried and warm, and you can follow it in whatever way feels most natural, listening closely, or half listening, or simply resting in the sound of words passing gently through the room. Let us move on now to the Renaissance, and the extraordinary reawakening of curiosity that transformed European thought between the 14th and 17th centuries. The Renaissance was, among many other things, a renewed interest in the human being as a subject worthy of careful and loving attention. Artists and scholars alike turned their gaze toward the body, the face, the expressions of emotion, the variety of human character and experience. Leonardo da Vinci dissected human corpses in order to understand the mechanics of the body, and he paid particular attention to the face, to the way that muscles moved beneath the skin to produce expressions of joy, sorrow, surprise, disgust. His anatomical drawings are works of science and art simultaneously, and they represent a kind of looking at human beings that is fundamentally psychological in spirit, even if it does not use that word. The invention of the printing press in the middle of the 15th century had an enormous effect on the development of psychological thought, as it had on so many other areas of human knowledge. Before printing, books were rare and expensive things, copied by hand in monasteries, available only to a small educated elite. After printing, ideas could travel across Europe within months. A book printed in Frankfurt could be read in London within a year. This meant that thinkers could engage with each other's ideas in ways that had been impossible before, that arguments could develop and evolve across national boundaries, and that the conversation about the nature of the mind began to accelerate in ways that would eventually lead, though by a long and winding road, to psychology as we know it today. Michel de Montaigne, the 16th century French writer, who essentially invented the personal essay, was in many ways one of the earliest psychologists, or at least one of the earliest writers, to make the inner life of a specific human being the sustained and serious subject of literary attention. His great work, The Essays, is a sprawling, intimate, endlessly curious exploration of his own thoughts, feelings, habits, fears, preferences, and contradictions. He wrote about his fear of death, and about how thinking carefully about death could paradoxically make life feel richer and less frightening. He wrote about the unreliability of memory, and about how the same experience could feel completely different depending on one's mood or physical state. He wrote about the strangeness of the self, the way that we are not quite the same person from one hour to the next, the way that we contain contradictions and cannot always explain our own behaviour. Every man carries the form of the human condition within him, Montaigne wrote, and that sentence contains within it the seed of an entire discipline. The idea that the study of one particular human mind, honestly and carefully conducted, could reveal something universal about what it means to be human is precisely the impulse that would eventually give rise to psychology as a formal field of inquiry. René Descartes, the French mathematician and philosopher who lived a few decades after Montaigne, approached the mind from a very different angle. He was interested in certainty and finding something that could not possibly be doubted, a fixed point from which all knowledge could be rebuilt. His famous conclusion, "I think, therefore I am," or in the original Latin, cogito ergo sum, is perhaps the most famous sentence in the history of philosophy, and it placed thinking itself at the centre of what it meant to exist. For Descartes, the mind was not just one part of the human being among others, it was the essential part. It was the part that could not be taken away. Descartes also made a sharp distinction between the mind and the body, what philosophers call the mind-body problem, or Cartesian dualism. He believed that the mind was a non-physical substance, fundamentally different in nature from the material body, and that the two interacted with each other through the pineal gland, a small structure near the centre of the brain. This idea seems strange to us now, and scientists eventually concluded that the pineal gland does not play the role Descartes assigned to it. But the underlying problem he was grappling with, how does consciousness relate to the physical brain? How do thoughts cause physical actions? Remains one of the deepest and most unresolved questions in all of science and philosophy. It is, in its way, still entirely open. John Locke, the English philosopher writing later in the 17th century, took a dramatically different view of the mind. Where Descartes had believed in innate ideas, concepts and principles that the mind was born already possessing, Locke argued that the mind at birth was a tabula rasa, a blank slate. He believed that all knowledge came from experience, from what the senses reported about the world. The mind, in Locke's view, was not equipped at birth with any preloaded content. It was formed entirely by what happened to it. The implications of this view were enormous for education, for politics, for our understanding of human nature, and they are still being worked out today in ongoing debates between those who emphasize the role of genetics and innate tendencies, and those who emphasize the role of environment and experience. There is something restful in that old debate in a way. It reminds us that the deepest questions about the mind have been with us for a very long time, and that the fact that they have not yet been fully resolved is not a failure but an indication of their extraordinary depth and richness. Some questions are worth living inside for centuries, which brings us gently to the 18th century and the age of reason that changed everything. The Enlightenment, as the 18th century is sometimes called, was an era of extraordinary intellectual confidence. Philosophers and scientists across Europe believed that reason, careful, systematic, empirical reason, could answer any question. They were applying the methods that had proved so spectacularly successful in physics and astronomy to everything else, to economics, to politics, to ethics, to the nature of the human mind. And while this confidence was sometimes misplaced, and while some of the conclusions that Enlightenment thinkers reached were deeply wrong and caused great harm, the basic impulse, the impulse to look carefully and honestly at reality and to try to understand it, was one that would eventually bear tremendous fruit. One of the most significant developments of this period for the eventual emergence of scientific psychology was the growth of what was called moral philosophy, the philosophical study of human nature, motivation, emotion, and behaviour. Scottish philosophers like David Hume and Adam Smith were doing something remarkably close to psychology, even though they did not use that word. Hume argued that reason was, in his famous phrase, the slave of the passions, that our emotions and desires determined our goals, and that reason was merely a tool we used to pursue those goals. This was a dramatic reversal of the Platonic view, which had placed reason at the top of the human hierarchy and seen the passions as something to be controlled and subordinated. Adam Smith, who is mostly remembered today as the author of The Wealth of Nations and a founder of modern economics, was also the author of a remarkable work called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which he argued that human beings have a natural capacity for empathy, for feeling something of what others feel, and that this capacity is the foundation of moral life. He described what he called the impartial spectator, an internalized imaginary observer that we use to evaluate our own conduct, asking ourselves how a fair and reasonable person would judge our actions. This is a concept that would find many echoes in later psychological theories, including Freud's superego and the self-monitoring processes that social psychologists study today. There is something else worth considering here, and it has to do with the relationship between philosophy and what we might call the everyday understanding of the mind. While the great thinkers of the Enlightenment were writing their treatises, ordinary people were also developing their own informal psychologies, their own ways of understanding why people behave as they do, what makes some people resilient and others fragile, what it feels like to grieve or to fall in love or to be seized by a sudden inexplicable fear. This folk psychology, passed down through conversation and story and proverb, has always run alongside the formal philosophical and scientific traditions, and it has always contained genuine wisdom that formal psychology is sometimes slow to acknowledge, but that it tends eventually to rediscover. There is nothing you need to hold on to right now. Let your shoulders drop a little if they have risen. Let your hands relax wherever they are resting. The story will continue at its own unhurried pace, and you can follow it from a great, comfortable distance if that is where you find yourself drifting. Let us move now to the 19th century, which is where psychology as a formal discipline truly begins. Wilhelm Wundt is often called the father of experimental psychology, and while that title, like most such titles, involves a certain simplification of a complicated story, it captures something real. In 1879, in Leipzig, Germany, Wundt established the first laboratory explicitly devoted to psychological research. This was a decisive moment. It was the moment when the study of the mind stepped, somewhat nervously, out of the philosopher's study and into the scientist's laboratory. Wundt was interested in what he called introspection, the careful, systematic observation of one's own mental states. He trained his subjects to observe and report their own inner experiences with as much precision as possible, breaking them down into their simplest components: a sensation of redness, a feeling of pressure, a moment of attention shifting from one object to another. He believed that by analyzing these elementary mental events carefully enough, it would eventually be possible to understand the structure of the mind the way a chemist understands the structure of matter, by identifying its fundamental elements and the laws that govern how they combine. This project, which came to be called structuralism, was ambitious and ultimately not entirely successful. The problem was that introspection, however carefully conducted, is extremely difficult to make reliable. Two trained observers sitting in the same laboratory, attending to the same experience, often reported quite different things. The inner world resisted the kind of precise, repeatable measurement that made the physical sciences so powerful. But the failure of structuralism was itself enormously productive. It showed what didn't work, which is always, in science, a valuable discovery, and it provoked responses and alternatives that would eventually prove far more fruitful. William James, an American philosopher and psychologist who was working at roughly the same time as Wundt, took a very different approach. Where Wundt wanted to analyze the mind into its elementary units, James was interested in the mind as it actually functioned in ordinary life as a flowing, dynamic, purposeful process, rather than a collection of static elements. He coined the phrase stream of consciousness to describe the continuous, ever-changing flow of thought and feeling that characterizes waking mental life. Every moment, he observed, flows into the next, and there are no real breaks or pauses in the inner life, only transitions and turnings. James was also deeply interested in habit, in the way that repeated behaviors become automatic, inscribed in what he called the nervous system, freeing attention for new and more demanding tasks. The great thing, he wrote, in one of his most often quoted passages, is to make our nervous system our ally instead of our enemy, to fund and capitalize our good actions, and live at ease upon the interest of the fund. This insight that habits are built in the body as much as in the mind, and that changing behavior often requires changing the conditions that support it rather than simply willing oneself to act differently, is one that would take many decades to be confirmed by neuroscience, but that many people have always known intuitively. James was also, quietly and tentatively, one of the first scientists to take seriously the study of religious experience, of mystical states, of what he called the varieties of religious experience, the full, extraordinary range of ways that human beings have felt themselves to be in contact with something larger than themselves. He approached these experiences not as a believer or as a skeptic, but as a scientist of the inner life, genuinely curious about what they could tell us about the nature of mind and the limits of ordinary consciousness. His book on the subject, published in 1902, remains one of the most illuminating things ever written about the psychology of the spiritual. From here, the story shifts to a figure whose name you almost certainly know, even if what you know about him is more caricature than portrait. Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 in what is now the Czech Republic, the son of a wool merchant, the eldest of 8 children. He was brilliant and driven and intensely curious, and he trained as a medical doctor in Vienna, with a particular interest in the workings of the nervous system. In his early career, he studied under Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris, one of the great neurologists of the 19th century, who was using a technique called hypnosis to treat patients with a condition called hysteria, a term that was applied almost exclusively to women to describe a wide range of physical symptoms. paralysis, blindness, convulsions, inability to speak for which no physical cause could be found. What Charcot demonstrated was that these symptoms, although they appeared to be physical, were in some sense mental. He could produce them through suggestion under hypnosis, and he could remove them the same way. This was astonishing. It meant that the mind could do things to the body that the medical understanding of the time could not account for, that there was a layer of mental activity operating somewhere below the level of conscious awareness, shaping experience and behavior in ways that the person experiencing them could not control or even observe directly. This insight, which Freud pursued and developed and eventually built an entire theoretical system around, is the founding insight of psychoanalysis. The unconscious, the idea that a significant portion of mental life occurs outside of conscious awareness, and that this hidden portion exerts a powerful influence on thought, feeling, and behavior, is Freud's central contribution to human self-understanding. And while many of the specific theories he built on that foundation have been revised, challenged, or abandoned by later research, the foundational insight itself has proved remarkably durable. We know, from many decades of cognitive science research, that a great deal of mental processing occurs below the threshold of consciousness. We process faces before we are aware of having seen them. We feel emotions before we know their cause. We make decisions that we then rationalize after the fact. The unconscious in one form or another is real. Freud developed a therapeutic method called the talking cure, a phrase coined not by Freud himself, but by one of his early patients, a young woman known in the case literature as Anna O, who described what happened in their sessions as a kind of chimney sweeping of the mind. The idea was simple and revolutionary, that speaking freely without censorship about whatever came into one's mind, memories, dreams, fantasies, fears, the seemingly trivial and the apparently shameful could gradually bring unconscious material into awareness, and that this process of bringing things into the light was itself healing. The method Freud developed, free association, asked the patient to say whatever came to mind without filtering or evaluating it. Dreams were considered particularly valuable material because Freud believed they represented the disguised fulfillment of unconscious wishes, a way the sleeping mind processed desires and conflicts that could not be safely expressed in waking life. He called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, a phrase that captures the excitement and wonder he felt in his work. It is worth pausing here for a moment, not to evaluate the accuracy of Freud's specific theories, that is a complex and contested question that researchers are still working through, but simply to appreciate the magnitude of what he did. He created a space in which a person could sit with another person and speak honestly about the inner life, and be listened to with full and undivided attention, and have the contents of that inner life treated as meaningful, as important, as worthy of serious inquiry. For many of his patients, this was an entirely new experience. For many people today, even after more than a century of psychotherapy in all its many forms, it remains something close to miraculous. Allow your breathing to find its own slow rhythm as we continue. There is no hurry here, and no destination that needs to be reached tonight. Just the quiet unfolding of a very old and very human story. Let us move on now to some of the other great figures of early psychology, and the remarkable variety of approaches that the field developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist who won the Nobel Prize in 1904, not for psychology, but for his work on the digestive system. What he is remembered for, however, is an observation he made more or less by accident while conducting that research. He noticed that his laboratory dogs, which he used to study how saliva was produced in response to food, began to salivate not just when food was placed in front of them, but when they heard the sound of the researchers' footsteps approaching. They had learned, through repeated pairing, to associate the sound with the arrival of food, and their bodies were responding to the sound as if it were the food itself. Pavlov called this process conditioning, and he spent the rest of his career studying it with extraordinary rigor and care. What he discovered was something fundamental about how animals, including human animals, learn. Experience creates associations. Neutral events that are repeatedly paired with significant events come to produce the same response as those significant events. This happens automatically, below the level of conscious intention. We don't choose to form these associations. They form themselves quietly and persistently as we move through the world. The implications of this discovery for understanding human psychology were immense. Even though Pavlov himself was primarily interested in physiology rather than psychology, if the body could learn to respond to a neutral stimulus as if it were a significant one, could that explain some of the seemingly inexplicable emotional responses that people sometimes experience? Could it explain the way that a particular smell can suddenly produce a wave of grief or joy, connecting us instantly to an experience from decades ago? Could it explain the way that certain places or sounds or times of day become freighted with emotion that seems to belong to them and yet actually belongs to something else entirely? John B. Watson, an American psychologist working in the early 20th century, read Pavlov's work and saw in it the foundation of an entirely new science of behavior, one that would abandon any talk of the inner life, the mind, consciousness, subjective experience, and focus exclusively on what could be observed. Stimulus and response, input and output, behavior that could be measured and predicted and controlled. He called this approach behaviorism, and he announced it with characteristic brashness in a famous paper published in 1913, in which he declared that psychology, to become a true science, must abandon the study of consciousness entirely. Watson's behaviorism was, in many ways, both powerfully productive and rather too extreme. It was productive because it brought genuine rigor and precision to the study of behavior, because it led to real and useful discoveries about how learning works, and because it eventually produced, in the hands of thinkers like B.F. Skinner, a practical technology of behavior change that found applications in education, therapy, and many other fields. It was too extreme because it denied or ignored aspects of human experience that are obviously real and important, the rich, vivid, continuous flow of inner life that every human being knows from the inside. Trying to build a psychology without reference to consciousness is a little like trying to build a theory of music without reference to sound. B.F. Skinner, who became the most famous behaviorist of the 20th century, extended Pavlov's work on conditioning in important ways. Where Pavlov had studied what Skinner called respondent conditioning, the way that existing reflexes could be attached to new stimuli, Skinner studied what he called operant conditioning, the way that behaviors are shaped by their consequences. If a behavior is followed by something pleasant or rewarding, it tends to be repeated. If it is followed by something unpleasant or unrewarding, it tends to diminish. This seems obvious, stated boldly, and in a sense it is something that animal trainers and parents and teachers have known in practice for as long as there have been animals and children. But Skinner studied it with great precision and discovered that the specific pattern by which rewards are delivered, the schedule of reinforcement, as he called it, has dramatic and sometimes counterintuitive effects on behavior. One of his most striking findings was that behaviors reinforced on what he called a variable ratio schedule, meaning that the reward comes unpredictably, Sometimes after a short sequence of the behavior, sometimes after a long one, are extraordinarily resistant to extinction. The animal or the person keeps performing the behavior long after the reward has stopped coming, because the unpredictability itself creates a kind of compulsion. Skinner demonstrated this with pigeons in laboratory boxes. The behavioral scientists who advise the developers of social media platforms and slot machines have applied the same principle with rather more far-reaching consequences. There is something deeply interesting and quietly humbling about the realization that our behavior is shaped by forces we are often not aware of. Not because this diminishes our sense of agency or freedom, but because it suggests that self-understanding is a project that requires genuine effort and genuine curiosity. We are not quite as transparent to ourselves as we sometimes assume, and that is precisely why the study of the mind has always felt important and urgent and inexhaustible. If your eyes are growing heavy now, that is perfectly fine. Let them close. The story will carry on around you, and you can rest inside it as if it were a room with warm walls and no corners sharp enough to catch you. Let us turn now to another great tradition in psychology, one that arose partly in response to the perceived coldness and narrowness of behaviorism, and that placed the inner life not just as an obstacle to be overcome, but as the very center and subject of inquiry. The humanistic psychology movement that emerged in the middle of the 20th century was in many ways a kind of correction. It said, yes, behavior matters, and yes, unconscious processes matter, but there is also something irreducible about conscious human experience, about the way it feels from the inside to be a person, to have goals and values and a sense of one's own life as something that can be lived well or badly, meaningfully or without meaning. Humanistic psychologists argued that a psychology worthy of the name had to take these things seriously. Abraham Maslow, an American psychologist who is one of the most widely cited figures in the humanistic tradition, proposed a theory of human motivation that became one of the most famous diagrams in the history of the social sciences, the hierarchy of needs. He suggested that human needs can be arranged in a rough hierarchy, from the most basic physiological needs, food, water, shelter, sleep through safety and security, through the need for love and belonging, through the need for esteem and recognition, up to what he called self-actualization, the full development and expression of one's unique capacities and potentials. Maslow's hierarchy has been criticized on various grounds by later researchers. The specific hierarchical structure is probably too rigid, and the idea that lower needs must be fully satisfied before higher needs can be addressed doesn't match the complexity of real human experience. People pursue meaning and beauty and connection, even in conditions of deprivation. But the basic insight that human beings are motivated by a wide range of needs, and that understanding those needs is essential to understanding behavior, has proved remarkably durable. And the concept of self-actualization, whatever its theoretical limitations, has captured something real about human aspiration. The deep desire to become, more fully, what one is capable of being. Carl Rogers was another central figure in humanistic psychology, and his contribution was perhaps more directly practical than Maslow's. Rogers developed what he called client-centered therapy, a therapeutic approach in which the relationship between therapist and client was itself considered the primary vehicle of healing, rather than any specific technique or interpretation. He argued that what most people who suffered psychologically needed, more than anything else, was to be truly heard, to have their experience received with what he called unconditional positive regard, acceptance that did not depend on the client behaving in any particular way or holding any particular beliefs. He believed that when people felt genuinely accepted, they had the capacity to grow and change in their own direction without needing to be directed or corrected by an authority. Rogers's ideas changed the practice of psychotherapy profoundly. The active listening skills that therapists learn today, reflecting back what the client has said, demonstrating understanding without judgment, following the client's own path rather than imposing a predetermined interpretive framework, are largely Rogerian in origin, and these skills have spread well beyond the consulting room, influencing how we think about good communication in education, in management, in relationships, in the many ordinary contexts in which one person needs to help another feel understood. There is something else worth considering here, something that Rogers himself reflected on late in his career. He observed that the experience of being truly heard, of having one's inner life received with full attention and genuine acceptance, was itself transformative, independent of anything else that happened in therapy. People changed not because they were given insight or instruction, but because they had the experience of being known and finding that the person who knew them did not turn away. In a world that often moves too fast for real listening, that observation carries a weight that seems to grow rather than diminish with time. Let us move on now to the cognitive revolution, which transformed psychology in the second half of the 20th century and whose effects are still unfolding. The cognitive revolution, and it was genuinely a kind of revolution, began in the 1950s and 1960s as psychologists and researchers in neighboring fields began to push back against the behaviorist insistence that the inner life was off-limits for scientific study. The computer, which was just emerging as a practical technology during this period, provided a new and powerful metaphor for the mind. The mind as an information processing system, taking in data from the senses, operating on it through various computational processes, storing it in memory, and producing behavioral outputs. This was not identical to the mind as brain, but it suggested that it might be possible to study mental processes, attention, memory, language, reasoning, problem-solving with scientific rigor, even without having a complete account of their neural underpinnings. One of the early figures in the cognitive revolution was George Miller, who published a famous paper in 1956 titled The Magical Number 7 Plus or Minus 2. Miller had been studying the capacity of short-term memory, the amount of information the mind can hold in active awareness at any given moment, and he found that it was strikingly limited. Most people, he discovered, can hold about 7 items in short-term memory, give or take a couple, regardless of whether those items are simple, individual digits, or more complex words or concepts. The capacity of the storage system seems to be measured not in bits of information, but in what Miller called chunks, meaningful units, however large or small. This finding has been refined and complicated by subsequent research, but the basic insight that conscious attention is a scarce and limited resource, that the amount of information the mind can actively process at once is surprisingly small, has proved tremendously important. It helps explain why learning complex skills requires so much repetition before they feel automatic, why multitasking is often much less efficient than it feels, and why the experience of being overwhelmed, of having more demands on attention than attention can sustain, is so common and so genuinely difficult. Ulrich Neisser, whose 1967 book Cognitive Psychology is often credited with giving the field its name, described cognition as all the processes by which sensory input is transformed, reduced, elaborated, stored, recovered, and used. That definition is striking in its ambition and its comprehensiveness. It says, in effect, that almost everything the mind does is cognition, and it claims all of it as legitimate territory for scientific study. Attention was one of the first cognitive processes to receive intensive scientific investigation. William James, decades before the cognitive revolution, had written memorably that everyone knows what attention is. It is the taking possession by the mind, in clear and vivid form, of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. But knowing what it is and understanding how it works are very different things. Cognitive psychologists discovered that attention is not a single thing, but a family of related processes with different components operating in different ways. There is what researchers call sustained attention, the ability to maintain focus on a task over time. There is selective attention, the ability to focus on one source of information while filtering out others. There is divided attention, the ability to track multiple things at once, and researchers discovered, among other things, that this last capacity is far more limited than most people believe. The famous experiment known as the cocktail party phenomenon, first described by Colin Cherry in 1953, demonstrated that people can, with effort, focus on one conversation in a noisy room full of competing voices. But what the experiment also showed was that even when you're successfully attending to one conversation, your mind remains passively monitoring other conversations for signals that might be relevant, like the sound of your own name. This discovery suggested that a great deal of monitoring and processing goes on below the threshold of consciousness, screening the world for information that the conscious mind might need to know. The unconscious, in other words, is not idle while the conscious mind is busy. Memory, which is in many ways the foundation of personal identity, the self is, among other things, the story of one's own past, became another central preoccupation of cognitive psychology in the latter half of the 20th century. Researchers discovered that memory is not a simple recording device, a kind of mental camera that captures experience and plays it back faithfully later. It is a reconstructive process, actively pieced together at the moment of recall from stored fragments and general knowledge and current expectations. This means that memory is fallible in ways that are often surprising and sometimes alarming. Elizabeth Loftus, one of the most influential memory researchers of the 20th century, conducted a long series of experiments that demonstrated just how susceptible human memory is to alteration by suggestion. In one classic study, she showed people films of car accidents and then asked them questions about what they had seen. She found that simply changing the wording of the questions, asking, "How fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other?" versus, "How fast were the cars going when they hit each other?" could change not just the estimates people gave, but also what people later claimed to remember seeing. People who had been asked the smashed question were more likely, when questioned a week later, to say they had seen broken glass at the scene of the accident, even though there had been no broken glass in the film. This research had profound implications for the legal system, where eyewitness testimony had long been considered among the most powerful forms of evidence. It turned out that eyewitness memory was often unreliable in ways that the witnesses themselves could not detect, that people could be entirely confident about memories that were significantly distorted, or even in some cases entirely false. The work of Loftus and others on false memory has helped reform how police conduct lineups, how attorneys question witnesses, and how courts evaluate the reliability of testimony. It is a beautiful example of how basic psychological research can have far-reaching practical consequences. You're in no hurry, neither is this world we're exploring together. Let your body settle a little more deeply into wherever it is resting. Let the sounds of this room and the sounds beyond this room become part of the background, gentle and undemanding. Let us consider now the extraordinary field of social psychology, which turns its attention not to the individual mind in isolation, but to the mind as it exists in relationship to others, shaped by groups, by norms, by the presence of other people, by the complex and sometimes vertiginous experience of being a social animal. Human beings are among the most intensely social creatures on earth. We are born more helpless than almost any other mammal, and we remain dependent on others for far longer. We evolved in small groups, and our brains reflect that heritage. They are, in many ways, exquisitely calibrated to track social information. We notice faces before we notice almost anything else. We're extraordinarily sensitive to the emotional states of the people around us. We feel the sting of social rejection in regions of the brain that also process physical pain. Solomon Asch, a social psychologist working in the 1950s, conducted a series of experiments that became among the most famous in the history of the discipline. He asked participants to judge which of several lines on a card matched a target line in length. The task was straightforward, and in a room alone people answered correctly almost all of the time. But then Asch introduced a complication. He placed the real participant in a group with several other people who appeared to be genuine participants, but were actually confederates of the experimenter, instructed to give the same obviously wrong answer, and he found that when faced with a unanimous group that disagreed with their own perception, a significant proportion of participants went along with the group answering incorrectly, even when the correct answer was entirely clear to them. Asch's conformity experiments have been interpreted in various ways. Some see them as demonstrating the troubling extent to which social pressure can override individual perception and judgment. Others have pointed out that conformity is not always irrational. Often the group really does know something the individual does not, and deferring to the group is a reasonable adaptive strategy. What the experiments most clearly show is that the boundary between the individual mind and the social environment is far more permeable than we might like to believe. We are not isolated perceivers, each objectively taking in a world that exists independently of our social relationships. We are social perceivers, and the two are different things. Stanley Milgram, working a few years after Asch, conducted what became perhaps the most disturbing and most discussed experiment in the history of social psychology. He was interested in obedience to authority and how far ordinary people would go in following the instructions of an authority figure, even when those instructions conflicted with their own values. In his experiments, participants were told they were taking part in a study of learning and memory, and were instructed to administer electric shocks of increasing intensity to another participant who made errors on a memory task. The other participant was in fact an actor, and no real shocks were delivered, but the participants did not know this. They heard what appeared to be screams of pain, pleas to stop, and eventually silence. Milgram found that a substantial majority of participants continued to administer shocks all the way to the maximum level on the scale, labelled danger, severe shock, as long as the experimenter, who wore a white coat and spoke in a calm, authoritative voice, continued to instruct them to do so. This result shocked the field and the broader public when Milgram wrote about it, and it has generated debate ever since about its ethics, its methodology, and what it actually demonstrates about human nature. The most important thing it demonstrates is probably something that we already knew in some sense, but that the experiment made impossible to deny, that the situation, the social context, the authority structure, the specific pressures and permissions and constraints of the immediate environment exerts an enormous influence on behavior, an influence that often surpasses what we would predict based on the individual's values or personality. This insight has been called situationism, and it is one of the most important and most humbling findings of 20th century social psychology. We are not as autonomous as we like to think. We are not as consistent across situations as we believe. We are, to a remarkable degree, creatures of context. Philip Zimbardo, whose Stanford Prison Experiment of 1971 explored how quickly ordinary people could adopt roles that led to abusive behavior, drew similar conclusions. His experiment, in which students were randomly assigned to play either guards or prisoners in a simulated prison environment, had to be stopped after 6 days because the guards had begun treating the prisoners in genuinely cruel ways, and the prisoners had developed real psychological distress. Zimbardo spent much of his subsequent career exploring what he called the Lucifer effect, the process by which good people can come to do terrible things under the influence of powerful, situational forces. These findings are sobering, but they are also, in an important sense, hopeful. If behavior is shaped powerfully by situation, then changing situations, designing environments that encourage cooperation and kindness rather than competition and cruelty, structuring institutions to reduce the concentration of power and the dehumanization of those subject to it can genuinely change how people behave. Knowing the truth about situational influence is not a counsel of despair, but a guide to effective action. Let us move on now to another direction the field has taken, one that feels particularly relevant to this quiet hour: the psychology of sleep, the scientific study of what happens to the mind and body during those mysterious hours when consciousness fades and the dreaming world takes over, is one of the younger fields within psychology, but it has produced some of the most extraordinary findings in the entire history of the discipline. For most of human history, sleep was regarded as something close to a minor death. The Greek god of sleep, Hypnos, was the twin brother of Thanatos, the god of death. The sleeper was thought to be temporarily absent, the soul wandering, as some traditions held, through the landscape of dreams while the body lay inert. What actually happens during sleep, as science has gradually revealed, is almost the opposite of absence. Sleep is a period of intense, purposeful, astonishingly complex activity. The discovery of rapid eye movement sleep, what we call REM sleep, came in the early 1950s, when a University of Chicago researcher named Eugene Aserinsky, working late one night in his laboratory, noticed that the eyes of his sleeping subjects were moving in ways that no one had previously described. He called in his advisor, Nathaniel Kleitman, who had been studying sleep for decades, and together they documented this strange new phenomenon. When they woke subjects during REM sleep, those subjects almost always reported vivid dreams. They had stumbled on the biological correlate of the dreaming mind. It is impossible not to feel a kind of awe at this discovery. This moment in which a night shift graduate student in a dimly lit laboratory noticed something that no one had ever noticed before, and realized, in the gradual way that such realizations come, that he was looking at something fundamental. The mind, all those centuries of dreams and wondering, had finally agreed to be watched. Further research revealed that sleep unfolds in cycles of roughly 90 minutes, each cycle moving through different stages of non-REM sleep, from light sleep to the deep slow-wave sleep of true restoration. and then into a period of REM sleep that becomes longer and more intense as the night progresses. This means that the long, vivid, emotionally rich dreams that people often remember most clearly tend to occur in the hours just before waking, when the REM periods are at their most extended. Matthew Walker, a sleep scientist at the University of California, Berkeley, has done much in recent years to communicate the importance of sleep to general audiences. He describes sleep as, among other things, a kind of overnight therapy, a process by which the emotional charge of difficult experiences is processed and to some extent removed. He points to research suggesting that during REM sleep, memories are replayed in the brain but in a neurochemical environment very different from waking specifically, an environment low in the stress-related molecule norepinephrine. This may allow the brain to process and consolidate emotional memories while reducing the pain associated with them in something like the way that an oyster creates a pearl, surrounding something that entered as an irritant and gradually transforming it into something smooth and contained. This research provides a neurobiological account of something that many people have noticed in ordinary life, that a good night's sleep often changes the emotional tone of a difficult experience, making it feel more manageable and less acute the morning after. Sleep on it as a piece of folk wisdom turns out to have more scientific grounding than the people who first offered it could have known. The glymphatic system, discovered only in the past 15 years or so, has added another layer to our understanding of why sleep matters. During sleep, and particularly during the deep, slow-wave sleep of the early part of the night, the brain's cells actually shrink slightly, increasing the space between them and allowing cerebrospinal fluid to flow through the brain more freely, flushing out metabolic waste products that accumulate during the day. One of the substances cleared by this process is a protein called amyloid beta, the accumulation of which has been associated with Alzheimer's disease. This discovery suggests that sleep may not only be important for emotional processing and memory consolidation, but also for the physical maintenance of the brain and a kind of nightly cleaning process that keeps the neural machinery in good order. There is a beautiful metaphor in this. While we surrender to sleep, something we cannot direct or even observe is taking care of us. The brain, in the absence of our conscious management, does its housekeeping. The very act of letting go of releasing our grip on the day and sliding into unconsciousness allows a kind of restoration that cannot be forced or hurried. Allow your breathing to find its own slow rhythm. There is nothing here that requires your management or your effort. The night is doing its work quietly and patiently, and you are allowed to simply be inside it. Let us consider now the psychology of emotion, which is both one of the oldest and one of the most actively evolving areas of the field. What is an emotion? The question sounds almost too simple to need asking, and yet it has proved remarkably difficult to answer. An emotion, as most people experience it, is a complex thing. It has a subjective quality, a feeling that is distinctly one's own, that exists from the inside in a particular way. It has a physiological dimension, the hammering heart of fear, the warmth in the chest of affection, the heaviness in the body of grief. It has a cognitive dimension. Emotions are usually about something, directed towards an object or a situation, involving some kind of appraisal or evaluation. And it has a behavioral dimension. Emotions typically produce tendencies to act in particular ways, to flee, to approach, to push away, to freeze. Charles Darwin, who is best known for his theory of evolution by natural selection, was also one of the pioneers of the scientific study of emotion. In his 1872 book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, he argued that human emotional expressions, the smile, the frown, the widened eyes of fear, the wrinkled nose of disgust, were evolved adaptations, inherited from evolutionary ancestors and serving similar functions in humans and other animals. He observed that the facial muscles involved in expressing emotion seemed to be the same across different human cultures, which he took as evidence for the biological universality of at least some emotional expressions. This claim that certain basic emotions and their expressions are universal, found in all human cultures regardless of geography or history, became one of the central and most debated questions in emotion research in the 20th century. Paul Ekman, an American psychologist who began his career in the 1960s, devoted decades to studying cross-cultural emotional expression. He showed photographs of people expressing emotions to participants in many different cultures, including isolated tribal groups in Papua New Guinea who had had little contact with Western media, and found that they recognized the expressions of what he called basic emotions: happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, surprise at rates well above chance. He concluded that these basic emotions had a universal biological basis, rooted in our evolutionary heritage. More recently, this conclusion has been challenged and complicated by researchers who argue that even the basic emotions are more culturally variable than Ekman's work suggested. Lisa Feldman Barrett, among others, has argued for what she calls the theory of constructed emotion, the view that emotions are not fixed, pre-wired responses, but are actively constructed by the brain from a combination of raw bodily sensations and culturally learned concepts. In this view, we feel what we have learned to feel. The categories our culture provides shape the emotions we experience, and people raised in cultures with different emotional vocabularies may experience something genuinely different, not just describe the same thing in different words. This debate is ongoing, and the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. There are both universal biological substrates for emotional experience and significant cultural variation in how emotions are categorized, expressed, and regulated. What is remarkable, from either perspective, is how central emotion is to everything the mind does. Emotions are not decorations on top of rational thought. They are, as Hume suggested centuries ago, deeply embedded in how we perceive, attend, remember, and decide. A person with damage to the emotion processing regions of the brain does not become more rational. They become, paradoxically, less able to make good decisions, because they have lost the evaluative signal that tells them what matters. Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist who has explored the relationship between emotion, reason and decision-making most extensively, describes what he calls somatic markers, bodily signals associated with past emotional experiences that the brain attaches to mental images of future actions, helping to guide decision-making by flagging certain options as good or bad before the conscious mind has fully evaluated them. We know in the body before we know in the head. The gut feeling that something is wrong or right is not mere superstition. It is information imperfect, sometimes misleading, but real. From here, the story shifts to one of the most exciting developments in the history of the field, the emergence of positive psychology and the turn toward understanding not just what goes wrong in the mind, but what allows it to flourish. For much of its history, psychology was predominantly a science of pathology. It studied mental illness, psychological distress, cognitive dysfunction, the various ways that the mind could be wounded or distorted or impaired. This was understandable. The suffering caused by mental illness is real and urgent, and understanding and alleviating it is a noble and important purpose. But it left a significant gap. What about the conditions that allow people to live well, not just the conditions that cause them to suffer? What about the mental processes that support resilience, creativity, wisdom, meaning, and flourishing? These questions had been largely neglected. Martin Seligman, who served as president of the American Psychological Association in 1998, used his presidential address to call for a reorientation of the field towards what he called positive psychology, the scientific study of the conditions that allow individuals, communities, and institutions to thrive. He and his colleagues began to develop research programs devoted to studying phenomena like gratitude, hope, character strengths, meaning, flow, and positive emotions, not as luxuries or afterthoughts, but as central topics worthy of serious scientific attention. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, whose surname is pronounced roughly Csikszentmihalyi, which is itself a fact charming enough to wake a sleepy listener for a moment, had been studying what he called flow for decades, before positive psychology gave it a larger platform. Flow is the state of deep, effortful, completely absorbed engagement with a challenging task that people report as among the most satisfying of their life experiences. Athletes call it being in the zone. Musicians speak of losing themselves in the music. Writers describe the experience of a passage seeming to write itself, the words arriving without resistance. What all of these experiences have in common, Csikszentmihalyi found, is the absorption of consciousness in the activity to the point where self-consciousness disappears, time distorts, and the activity and the person doing it seem to merge. This state, he argued, requires a careful balance between the challenge of the task and the skill of the person doing it. Too much challenge relative to skill produces anxiety. Too little challenge relative to skill produces boredom. In the narrow channel between these two experiences, when the difficulty of the task is matched to the full extent of one's abilities, flow becomes possible. And in flow, people consistently report feeling more alive, more engaged, more themselves than at almost any other time. What is remarkable about flow is that it is often described as effortless, even though it requires enormous effort. The effort is absorbed into the activity, rendered invisible by the depth of the engagement, and when it ends, when the athlete crosses the finish line, when the musician stops playing, when the writer surfaces from the paragraph, there is often a quality of return, of coming back from somewhere, of re-entering ordinary consciousness from a place that felt, while it lasted, unusually real. Barbara Fredrickson's broaden and build theory of positive emotions is another contribution of positive psychology that has proved rich and generative. Fredrickson observed that while negative emotions tend to narrow attention and behavior, fear makes us run, anger makes us fight, disgust makes us turn away, positive emotions tend to broaden attention and behavior, opening the mind to new possibilities, new connections, new ways of seeing. And she proposed that this broadened attention over time builds lasting personal resources, social connections, creative skills, resilience, and physical health. Joy, curiosity, gratitude, awe, love, these are not merely pleasant feelings. They are, in Fredrickson's account, the very processes by which human beings grow and develop their capacities over time. You've been here long enough tonight. You can go now. Sleep well, and good night.